Okay, so let's start in on the text. The thing that impresses Smith the most is this division of labor, and it's sort of famous. I mean, he sort of discovers this. Well, doesn't discover it, but sort of makes it a real theme to now be taken up as an issue for planning production. So Smith has been really influential here. The division of labor is the reason for this increased production. He talks about this pin manufacturer where if you work diligently for all day, back in the day, you could make 20 pins, but they bring 8 guys in to each one doing one job, and they make 48,000 pins. 48,000 pins versus 20. Not 20,000, 20 pins. 48,000, that's like that. That's like so many. I mean, it's like jaw dropping. I don't even have any pin needs, and I still can recognize that, wow, that's a lot of pins, right? 20 to 48,000. Why? Because the division of labor. So he goes through and he articulates some of these things. Now, it's important to note that there's a couple of passages I want to highlight here. He says it both on page 14 and 15. It's like facing pages. He says like almost exactly the same thing. He says, a workman not educated to this business, nor acquainted with the use of machinery employed in it, could scarce perhaps with utmost industry make 1 pin a day, and certainly not make 20. And then right on the facing page, but if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this particular business, they certainly could not have made each of them 20, perhaps not even 1 pin a day. In other words, he says the same phrases, but what does he say here? He says a person not educated to this business. Now, I'm wondering, should we take issue with this word? What is the difference between education and training, right? Training, it seems to me, is what he would mean here. Maybe it's just he doesn't have these words to be able to choose from, or they educated might mean something different back in the day, slightly different or whatever. But keep in mind here, education is supposed to at least not have an end. Training does. When you're up and running on the machine, we don't keep training you, right? That's all you need. You stop there. When you have enough to do it, that's where you stop, right? Education is not supposed to stop. Also, what is education supposed to see the whole, where training is about a part? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different distinctions one can make here, and I encourage you to think about what it is you're getting in your education. Is it training or is it education? Are you being trained to do one task and nothing else? Are you trained to be thinking outside of that, at the whole of it? Does it end with work only? Does education end with work? I mean, that's training then, right? So, or might have something in common more with training than education. So I keep these ideas in mind. I think they're interesting to think through. There's 3 things that Smith says that are just like, well, the cause of, what is it about the division of labor, he asks, that makes 48,000 pins versus 20? Because there's something going on here that is just amazing. And his answer is threefold, right? The dexterity of the worker, the time spent working, and machines that are introduced into the manufacturing process. So I want to take a look at each one of these individually and what he says about them. And while we do this, what I want you to keep in mind here, we're looking for Smith's ambivalence, right? We're going to see some of it coming up here in a minute, as well as some of the things that he says that the ambivalence of which maybe he's just sort of indicating it's difficult to say. So this is what I have in mind for the next section. We'll turn to the division of labor, dexterity, time, and machines. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take a look at the understanding of these 3 moments of the division of labor that Smith identifies that are the cause, that are the reason why dividing labor results in this increase of production. Now, the first thing that he says is that it reduces the worker's operation to one sole activity, right? And he makes this point several times: one sole activity, one sole function, one sole thing that is his for his whole life, right? So that's this pin straightener, straighten pin, straighten pin, straighten pin, straighten pin, straighten pin. Boy, oh boy, you get good at straightening a pin, huh? Do it behind your back, eyes closed, one-handed, whatever. You straighten a pin, you're like really good at it, especially if it's been your job for your whole life. Now, this sounds kind of strange, who wants to, how, even the thought of straightening a pin for my whole life makes me want to find a bridge to jump off. Now, I'm kidding, don't do that. But it's like, wow, that kind of monotony would just be crazy, right? But this is an example here of what he's talking about. So the pin straightening issue is an example. One of the things I want to ask you is something like this. And we'll see, Smith is going to come right back to this. We're looking at the division of labor. And what happens in the division of labor, we're looking at it in a really simple instance, this pin manufacturer. This is the word that they say, manufacturer and factory, right? So this pin factory, let's look at what each one does so that we can understand it here. And then we'll understand the division of labor maybe more broadly. And where we're going with this is something like the division of labor being applied everywhere. Like physics, biology, the computer, all technology, any place, everywhere. We'll see in a second. So the pin straightening thing is just an example of this kind of division of labor. So when I say sole thing for the whole life, you'll get really good at straightening a pin if you do that all your life, sure. But the same thing holds true if you're doing a legal brief, a lab tests, computer programming, whatever. Did you choose a major to do one job for the rest of your life? Is that how you've chosen? The fact that there's a major has already set us up for doing one sole job for the rest of our lives. A pin straightening job is an example of working one job for the rest of your life. The division of labor is narrowing things down like that, okay? So we're going to come back around and understand that again. But what this means is that if there's a problem with the division of labor, that problem's going to show up wherever the division of labor shows up, even if it's in law firms, science labs, or pin manufacturers, right? So this is where we want to keep an eye on. So the dexterity, again, back to the dexterity. Oh, one job done for life makes you really good. Then there's this thing here, and it's Smith's use of the dependent clause that hides the matters a little bit. But let's take a look at the paragraph that continues onto that page. It's at the bottom there. The different operations into which a pin making or a metal, the different operations into which the making of a pin or a metal button is subdivided are all of them more simple, and the dexterity of the person whose life it has been the sole business to perform them is usually much greater. The rapidity with which some of the operations of those manufactures are performed exceeds what a human hand could, by those who had never seen them, be supposed capable of acquiring. Now, I made mention of this. First of all, see here that sole business bit, that's important. And then he says this: the rapidity with which some of the operations of those manufacturers are performed exceed what the human hand could be supposed capable of acquiring. If we skip that little dependent clause there, what he's saying is that the human hand, with this division of labor and this one sole task, the human hand can make more than a human hand can make. In other words, what he's saying is that we become machine-like. All right, so with dexterity, we see the first opportunity to point towards Smith's ambivalence, right? Boy, oh boy, they can produce like mad. Actually, they can produce so much, they produce more than a human hand can produce. They become machine-like. But they can produce, but they become machine-like. But boy, oh boy, they can produce machine-like. So here's what you see. You see what I'm saying? So this next thing is dexterity, time, and machine. So time, the time saved. Now, there's a few things about the nature of the time saved and the consequences of that that are really important here for Adam Smith. And I think for us, I think that there is a legacy built into Adam Smith's thinking here that, I'm going to say this, haunts us. And I mean haunt because it is there like a spirit hanging over us, a judging spirit that makes us understand ourselves and our community in a certain way. And I'm not sure I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it's important to underscore. So dexterity, time, and machines are the reasons that the division of labor is so productive. We talked about dexterity, time. Because you're doing one job, you're not switching jobs, right? So going from one job to another causes a lot of delay. So if you just sit doing one thing, you don't waste your time moseying around, right? So, and what do you do with that time saved? You make more, okay? So think now that your time is understood in terms of your productivity, right? So you can waste time by not producing, or you could make good use of time by producing all of the time, right? So, the fact that you are liberated in your world is not a liberation to skole, leisure time, right? That was back in the day. No, the liberation now is to more poiesis, more production. Thinking Aristotle from previous lectures. So, time freed is time to spend producing. And how do you free time? By doing one task. Now, there's a couple of passages here that I find to be problematic. So I want to take a look at them and read them closely. He talks about a country weaver, right? So that means a farmer weaver who goes out and tends his farm, comes in, weaves some fabrics or something, and so he's got two jobs. Two jobs is not one job. What's going to happen? So let's read this. A country weaver, so this is page 18 on to page 19. A country weaver who cultivates a small farm must lose a good deal of time in passing from his loom to his field and from his field to his loom. When the two trades can be carried on in the same workhouse, the loss of time is no doubt much less. Now think, loss of time. Oh, I lost time. That could have been time I could have produced. Oh, the loss of time. It is even the case, however, very considerable. Now listen to this. A man commonly saunters a little in turning his hand from one sort of employment to another. When he first begins the new work, he is seldom very keen and hearty. His mind, as they say, does not go to it. And for some time he rather trifles than applies to good purpose. So rather trifles, saunters a bit. His mind does not go to it. Apply yourself. So listen to, there's sort of like a moral judgment there, and we're not done. The habit of sauntering and of indolent, careless application, that's judgment. Indolent, lazy, careless, that's not a happy thing. Lazy, careless application. Do you hear finger wagging at you? Because this is a judgment. Hey, apply yourself. Get your mind to it. Pay attention to what you're doing. Chop, chop, produce. The habit of sauntering, like moseying, get to it. Sauntering, the habit of sauntering and of indolent, careless application. And listen to this language, which is naturally, or rather necessarily acquired by every country workman who is obliged to change his work and his tools every half hour and apply his hands to to apply his hand in 20 different ways almost every day of his life. 20 different ways. He's got to do 20 different things, right? So now listen to the language. Naturally or necessarily. The country workman naturally, necessarily becomes lazy because he's got to do more than one job. the country workman so if I were to use the word naturally to say something happens by nature means that it happens like regardless of what I want, right? It's going to happen no matter what. So he says so to say something happens by nature is a strong assertion. He says by nature and then changes it no necessarily, which is another, I mean, almost equally as strong of an assertion, if not stronger, but they might even, I'm not even sure that there's a lot of overlap between those words too. But you will naturally no necessarily become lazy because you do more than one job. Indolent, careless application, laziness. Let's read further. So the person that does that, applying his hand in 20 different ways, renders him almost always slothful and lazy and incapable of any vigorous application, even on the most pressing of occasions, right? So here when we got it done, you're over there like going doop-de-doop-de-doop. Get to it, you know? You must have been doing more than one job. So, you know, but do hear, also I want you to hear this. There's a sort of, there's a moral accusation about the nature of productivity, right? So, not being productive is bound to not having the things that you need to enter into the marketplace, right? So, somebody who does more than one job is going to be lazy and slothful. Those people need to like change their habits so that they can be wealthy, right? Get to it and you'll be wealthy. But this means that there's something like an equating of poverty and laziness, poverty and slothfulness, poverty and like a bad moral character, right? So this is a very dangerous linking together, right? And this is when I say that there's something about Smith that haunts us, I'm pointing to this because this idea that, I mean, have you ever thought about, you know, when I talk about there's a concept in Smith that haunts us. This is the one I mean. I mean, we tie ourselves, we judge ourselves, we measure our self-esteem by way of our work, right? I mean, there are those who have a job, I forget what the trendy name is for it, job bash or whatever, make fun of people for doing jobs that are like beneath them in some way, right? What do you think about the unemployed, right? The lazy. I mean, even if you don't think that, I mean, there's that constant sort of like, you know, unemployment should only be momentary, right? And I've lost jobs before for other reasons. The place is closed down or whatever, and I find myself saying, and I've heard others say something like this, you know, man, I lost my job, but I'm looking for a new one. You know, don't think for a second that I'm like acquiescing in my joblessness. No. I'm right at it, right? And so, like the measure of our like really our value and our worth, our moral worth, is tied to our work and our wealth. And here, that binding that together means that if you are poor, well, you deserve it. Just work harder, right? I mean, I'm not poor. You and me are equal. Go be equal to me and don't be poor. Chop chop, right? It's your own fault that you're poor. Work harder. You know, like this is, I've solved poverty. I'm going to go into the poorer neighborhoods with the bullhorn and say, you know, work harder. Huh. So this is an issue, the binding together of this poverty and moral character, as well as wealth and moral character too. So that's a thing to keep in mind when you're considering. This is one of those things that I have called Smith's assumption. Sorry, I'm getting Smith and Marx confused somehow in my language. Smith's assumptions. I don't think that this assumption is correct. I'm not sure though. I mean, does doing more than one job make me naturally, no necessarily, lazy and slothful? I mean, the Renaissance man is the lamest thing in the world for Adam Smith. You can only be a Renaissance man if you're rich. We're coming to that. Check this out. So the next stop on our exploration of Smith is dexterity time. Now we're on to machines. So the introduction of technology is, of course, going to help skyrocket production. And Smith takes a look at these machines in two ways. So he says that, first of all, the machines sort of modeled off the worker. So when we break down this job of making a pen into 8 different things, then there's just like straightening. There's a straightening station, right? And the straightening station does like one thing. Well, you know what else does one thing? Machines. We can make them to do one thing. As a matter of fact, that's all we can make machines do. So we can make a machine to do that one thing. So they can make a straightening machine. And that's sort of modeled off of the straightening station of the worker. But of course that puts the worker out of business, but we're not here for them. The other thing is that the story, I think the story is funny, is this boy straps a rope or something like that from a lever to this valve so that the lever would pull the valve whenever one opened, whatever like that. And the boss comes around and says, "That's great. Go home." I was like, "Oh, yeah, super. I no longer need you." One of the things he says, and this is another really important point. This is one of those Smith's ambivalences. Boy, oh boy, does he point to something here that is similar to Marx, a very important issue about how the division of labor is going to affect the worker. So he says the first machines were probably developed by the workers who, because they were just working at them, figured out, I can make a machine that does this. But then he says on the next page that the development of machines is probably done more often by people that like specialize in this, or philosophers whose job it is to do nothing but to observe everything, right? So who's the most creative people is going to be the people that he calls philosophers. He means something like the scientist in the more general sense, but the man whose job it is to do nothing. Think about Aristotle and who's in a position to be able to think about things other than the things that they do right now and their jobs, right? We want to have somebody who can be outside of that, who can think at all, says Aristotle. Smith says something similar here too. I want to highlight this. Got to read the footnotes, and of course, read the footnotes. In this case especially, read footnote 17. It is on page 20. Footnote 17 says that it is stated at another part in The Wealth of Nations that invention of this kind is generally the work of free men, men free from work. On the other hand, Smith argues at another point that the mental faculties of the workers are likely to be damaged by the division of labor, thus affecting the flow of invention from this source. Let me say that again. The mental faculties of the laborers are likely to be damaged by the division of labor, thus affecting the flow of invention from this source. Doing one job, your productivity is going to shoot through the roof, but you are also putting blinders on, and your world is going to look like this, and your world is going to look like this, and your world is going to look like this, right? So it's such that all you will ever see is the world in terms of your one task, and you'll never be able to stand outside of that. There's I think it's a Chinese saying that, to the man who owns a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail to be pounded in, right? So your work is going to inframe your vision. You do one thing. Now remember, I know that straightening a pen makes everyone want to stop doing anything completely. If you had to do that for a long time, boy, oh boy. But this is an example. This is an example, and it is not the whole of the division of labor. What we're going to see is that there's a lot of ways that one can do one sole job. Doctor and lawyer are one sole job. Okay? So we'll turn to that next.